So I've mentioned previously that there was a novel that I was trying to write that I put on hold that was basically a work of like fictional nonfiction. And the one person who really liked it, I think I might have mentioned, compared it to David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest, which my understanding, I have not read this book yet, is a similar conceit, or my understanding is that this is like written as a nonfiction work, even though it's fiction. And I've been thinking about that concept. I still have not read this book, although I have a video I want to make about it, even having not read it, that might come out at some point soon. But I have read this book, which is a similar conceit, and it's really interesting. I mentioned before I like alternate history, and this is, the guy who wrote it is an economic historian, and this is an economic history of competition between, so the American revolutionaries lost and were executed, but their lower ranking people, they fled, they conquered Mexico, and they built a Jeffersonian democracy, while the British built a much more, basically a giant Canada. And it's the story of the competition between these two economic and political systems. And I want to reread it. I don't know if when I will, because I think some interesting themes, like I've talked about John Gray, Two-Faced of Liberalism behind me somewhere. And I think that this is not quite the same distinction, but this same idea of two sort of visions of liberty is still interesting, and I want to reread it for that reason. But at the time, I was mostly interested in just the narrative of the geopolitical rivalry between these two fictional countries and the history and the cultural economic development of them. So I wanted for a while to make a video on fictional nonfiction and non-fictional fiction, because I don't have a lot to say about this until I reread it, until I read Infinite Jest maybe too. But the concept is interesting, and I was wondering, well, is there the reverse? Is there non-fictional fiction? And one thing that occurred to me is that fairy tales, folklore, arguably could fall into that category. But then I saw a video by, I mentioned a few times, like her channel, Allison Talks Books, and she was talking about, she read a book that she realized was narrative history, and I realized this is a category that I have read, and I didn't know what it was, and in particular, for the same book that I mentioned writing Footy on Hold, I read this book, which is by the guy who wrote Last King of Scotland, which my mother watched the movie and I saw parts of it. I have not read the book. And the story is really interesting. It's about the British dragging gunships over to Lake Tanganyika in the First World War to fight the Germans who had also done that. And the guy who was leading the British was a complete narcissist, at least as he's portrayed. And it's a fascinating story. I struggled with the sort of narrative style for whatever reason. Like I can read scientific memoirs, I have that video on that, and I can read regular history and I can read novels, but this particular style, short book, easy read, so I made it through, but I didn't love it, which is why I was like, okay, I'm curious to read this now, but I also don't really want to start it because I didn't like his writing style. And so I think this could qualify as non-fictional fiction because the content is basically true, but it is presented in a fictional manner. And so don't really have more to say about that. This is a concept I've wanted to talk about for a while, but I was wondering what even would non-fictional fiction be? And then when Allison made that video, I'm like, oh, this would be a good example of that, I think. So anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, this is Leela, and I will see y'all in the next one.